I want to start by just thanking both of you for your attention on Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. It was clear early on with the radars down, in particular at all those airfields, there were certain things DoD does particularly well and needed to do in order to get those bottlenecks out of the way. So we very much appreciate that focus. I want to go back to Iran and the line of questioning that Senator King had, and start with just asking if Iran maintains its compliance with the JCPOA, but Congress votes to reimpose sanctions anyway, would we, as the U.S., be in violation of our obligations under the JCPOA under that scenario?
Senator, I don't know. I'd have to look at what the conditions specifically would call for under the JCPOA and what in particular we would not be willing to do. Congress has a role to play in this that we see it as distinct but integral. In other words, we look at this problem set as having two distinct aspects, the JCPOA itself and the congressional action. And I'd have to compare the details on that, Senator.
One of the reasons why I ask is because the scenario I'm worried about is if we unilaterally withdraw from the JCPOA, I'm concerned about a scenario where Iran gets to keep its sanctions relief, but where we lose key enforcement and intelligence advantages. Is there a scenario where those things come to pass that could possibly be in our national security interest? Because if we're not careful, we could end up with the worst of both worlds, right?
Well, if it's mishandled, yes, Senator, that could happen. It is, as you know, it is still under consideration in the executive branch, and a decision has not been made.
I would just urge you to consider that, because if we end up in a situation where we're not able to reinstate the sanctions that were multilateral, but we also lose our ability to effectively enforce the nuclear agreement, we've sort of lost on both sides of the ledger, and that would be a very unfortunate outcome for our national security. I want to go back to Afghanistan for a moment. I think it's clear that a very concise, clear strategy is essential, both for a positive end state in Afghanistan, but also absolutely key for our troop morale. And I think it's been challenging with a conflict that's gone on for 16 years and a positive end state in many ways still over the horizon to maintain troop morale. How do you describe troop morale in Afghanistan at the moment?
Senator, I was just there a couple days ago, and I got on board the aircraft after our last stop with Secretary General Stoltenberg. And here's an outside observer looking at the probably a dozen different forces, nations' forces, our own being dominant, of course, of the groups that he saw. And he said, you know, I'm amazed at how high the morale is, that they have such a strong sense of purpose. And I think it humbles all of us to think after 16 years. I mean, I personally landed in Afghanistan in November of 2001.
I remember.
And after 16 years, it reminds us we have a national treasure in the U.S. military, that these young patriots, young people, anyone who thinks we got a problem in the younger generation hadn't seen these lads and lasses in action. They're phenomenal. They look past the hot political rhetoric, say, give me the job, give me the authority, and let me go at it. Give me what I need. And there's a commitment out there that humbles me to this day.
I couldn't agree more with your sentiment with regard to the quality of people serving in our military today, and that's certainly been my experience both here and overseas in places like Afghanistan and, unfortunately, a number of other places as well. I want to ask, what is the current price tag for security in Afghanistan? Are we still roughly spending about $5 billion a year? General Dunford.
Senator, we're spending about $12.5 billion.
12.5.
And 1.1 is the cost of the uplift that we've just proposed.
What is, I think it was General Nicholson who testified at one point that roughly 10% of our total allocations were for security were picked up by the Afghan government. Should we expect to be paying that in perpetuity? Is there any end in sight? Like, what is the limit?
Sure. Senator, where that figure comes from, there's about $500 billion a year is what it takes to sustain the Afghan forces. And the international community coalition has paid about $5 billion for the Afghan forces specifically. The $12 billion was the cost of the entire operation that I spoke about earlier. The Afghan forces specifically is $5 billion. About $1 billion is paid by our international partners, members of NATO and so forth, and $500 million is paid for by the Afghan government. We would expect that that figure will increase over time and the Afghans will become more self-sufficient. Right now, the Afghans have commitments from the international community in the United States as a result of a NATO summit until 2020. And so after that, there's going to have to be a plan for sustaining the Afghan security forces.
Thank you both.